It's a big scandal tonight. What drug companies are not telling you about antidepressants that they're selling to millions and millions of Americans. Some people say that they can't live without Prozac, Paxil, and other drugs. But a new study says that the pills may not be helping them as much as they think, or that they're led to believe.
Heather, what this study confirms is what we've been reporting for years, namely that antidepressants often do not do what they promise and are in fact causing harm to many. When Lynn Michaels was 37 years old, she contracted Lyme's disease. She says she chose to go on an antidepressant because she wanted to feel better, and the drugs had gotten so much good publicity, both in the media and in their commercials.
Talk to your doctor about Zoloft.
What had you heard about antidepressants?
Well, at the time, they were non-habit-forming drugs. There was no risk of addiction, and I could try Paxil, this new miracle drug, and I could see if I liked it, and if not, I could get off of it.
But she couldn't get off, even after the drug had stopped working.
I went into complete and total despair. I was unable to think straight. I was unable to sleep. I was in total panic.
And you spent years trying to wean yourself off.
I spent 8 years trying to find a way off the drugs.
And what happened during that time?
It cost me my personal life, my marriage, my professional life.
Now, a blockbuster study in the New England Journal of Medicine confirms what Lynn already knew from personal experience, that the effectiveness of antidepressants has been overhyped. In fact, the study, reported on today in the Wall Street Journal, goes even further, claiming pharmaceutical companies exaggerated the effectiveness of 12 popular antidepressants, including Paxil, Effexor, and Zoloft, by publishing the results of positive clinical trials while suppressing the results of negative clinical trials. Fox Business anchor David Asman interviewed the study's author, Eric Turner, last night.
What a bombshell, Dr. Turner. How did you find out about all this?
Well, we used FDA review documents. I used to be an FDA reviewer and used these documents, which I knew contained information on not only published trials that get published, but also unpublished studies as well.
And Turner also found that when a negative study was published, the negative parts of the study were simply left out. But an industry lobbying group calls Turner's report incomplete. Pharma found that its authors neglected to mention the fact that industry and government have already taken proactive steps to make clinical trial information transparent and accessible, meaning negative trials may be available on company websites. But Turner points out most doctors get their information from reading medical journals, and he says those journals have given doctors a skewed view about the effectiveness of antidepressants.
There are no long-term studies on the safety or efficacy of any of these drugs. They're very dangerous.
Lynn says she's now designed a program to help fellow sufferers wean off antidepressants. That program, she says, can be found at her website, ssriresearch.com. She cautions, however, that no one should try to get off antidepressants cold turkey. She says, John and Heather, it's very important to wean off slowly.
"15 years ago, I warned the FDA and I warned the country in toxic psychiatry that antidepressants were causing a stimulant amphetamine-like syndrome that was resulting in violence and murder. In 1994, in talking back to Prozac, I warned the country and the FDA again, this time with tons now of scientific data on the same issues. During that period of time, I was asked to be, and this is very relevant to your deliberations, the scientific investigator for all of the combined Prozac suits, almost 200 of them. So I got to look at all the sealed data that Eli Lilly didn't want anybody else to see. So about 20 books later now, and a few dozen scientific studies, and innumerable product liability suits where I've looked at sealed data, I've come to tell you that you're evaluating junk. You're evaluating carefully edited, expurgated data that I've seen and you haven't. This is a most remarkable circumstance, that you have resources, people who have been inside the drug companies, who can tell you what's happening inside the drug companies, and of course, you've avoided it. All the documents I'm going to discuss now are on my website, www.bregan.com, and they've all been given to you, sent to you via the committee. In 1985, the Germans asked Eli Lilly to review all of its controlled clinical trials, phase 2, phase 3 for suicidality. The company came up with 12 suicide attempts on Prozac, 1 on alternative antidepressant, and 1 on placebo, a raging signal which the company did not report to the Germans, did not report to the FDA, and did not report at the 1991 hearings. In addition, the company hid suicidal data. When it would get an incoming suicide from the field, it would reclassify it as depression. It would reclassify it as no drug effect. Claude Boucher, who was in Germany working for Eli Lilly, wrote an ashamed memo to the central office saying, "How would I explain this to, quote, my family, to, quote, a judge?" But he said we would, of course, go along with what the company said. And as for akathisia, the company was very clever. It didn't code akathisia, so none were reported. It wasn't an available term. I found innumerable cases of akathisia combing through the company files that were never reported. GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, on Paxil, combing through their files, I have found suicides that haven't found their way, suicide attempts.
Thank you. The next speaker is Joseph Glenmullen.
My name is Joe Glenmullen. I'm a clinical instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and the author of 2 books, Prozac Backlash and The Antidepressant Solution, both of which describe my experience with patients having this side effect. The data the advisory committee is looking at today is flawed, as the FDA well knows. Although the FDA has known about this side effect since 1990, it has never insisted that a pharmaceutical company study the phenomenon with sensitive measures of treatment-emergent suicidality. On September 20th, 1991, the FDA held a hearing just like today's and swept this issue under the carpet. At the time, the FDA and Eli Lilly, Prozac's manufacturer, agreed that Lilly would do the gold standard research. Lilly developed the protocol for the research, including sensitive scales of treatment-emergent suicidality, yet Lilly never did the research, and the FDA still hasn't gotten the gold standard research done. Given the limitations of the data the advisory committee is looking at today, the powerful evidence of antidepressant-induced suicidality occurring in patients under 25 years old and 45 to 64 years old mandates a warning for all age groups. The increased risk for under 25-year-olds is statistically significant, as acknowledged by the FDA. Although not statistically significant, the powerful evidence of risk for 45 to 64-year-olds meets the statutory requirements for FDA to issue a warning. You cannot leave out 25 to 45-year-olds because the limitations of the data are the most likely reason why the risk for this age group does not appear in today's data set. Statisticians know that when low-quality data, such as today's, shows a risk, higher quality data would show a stronger risk. Especially since the FDA has not done the gold standard research, you must extend the warning to all age groups. Warning patients does not scare them away from treatment. It allows them to make informed choices and save lives. Think how many lives could have been saved if the FDA warned about this side effect back in 1991 when it first evaluated the issue and swept it under the carpet. Think how many families and communities have been devastated by this side effect in those 15 years. Do the right thing today and extend the black box warning to all age groups. If you do anything short of that, once again, the FDA has failed to protect the American public and American patients. Thank you.
Hello, colleagues. Could you have a quick look at the first slide there? Truth is stranger than fiction. Well, of course it is, said Mark Twain. Fiction has to make sense. The question is, what would Mark Twain have classified this posting from the FDA as? Truth or fiction? That's the distribution of the suicidal acts that happened in the registration trials of these 3 drugs here. But slide 2, and I don't know how to move the slides forward. Yeah, this is how the company reports FDA reviews of the drug and journal articles report those acts. You referred earlier to the Ferguson et al. Article, in which I'm a co-author. We had to cope with this. We didn't undo this particular bit of bias to come to the results we had. The results we had would have been worse if we had undone this. You referred to the MHRA article. Well, MHRA included 3 placebo suicides that weren't on placebo in clinical trials. People who, a week after going on Prozac, went on to commit suicide. Dr. Loughran has an article from 2001 in which he's the sole author that repeats this mistake. Dr. Loughran, in this particular document here, gives you no hint that all of the articles that he refers to showing that there is no increase in risk also repeat the mistake that you see here. But this is the most interesting slide. This you won't have seen, perhaps. This is data from 3.5 years ago. This is data from FDA that FDA put in the public domain. This shows you a clearly statistically significant increased risk of suicide. FDA said 3.5 years ago, but we can get this risk to go away if we control for age and sex. Now, controlling for age and sex in controlled RCTs to begin with suggests you're doing something awfully odd, that the clinical trials were invalid to begin with. FDA also said that when we control for location, that it actually makes a difference. And this year, FDA reported that when you look at the clinical trials that happened in the US here, the placebo-controlled trials, that there were fewer people went on to actually commit suicide. I'm sure you know that there are clinical trialists here in the US who've ended up in jail for entering fake patients into this clinical trial program. Fake or bogus patients do all sorts of interesting things. They get well on treatment. They don't commit suicide. It's just inconvenient for the audit trail if they do. Does this explain FDA's findings? I think you've asked the right questions. You've asked, why have FDA left out the people who seem to be doing poorly, the people who drop out from the...
Thank you.
All of these drugs, the data that is given to the FDA for approval is off of studies that are paid for by the drug companies themselves. And we know drug companies have gotten into some serious trouble over the years, some serious fines because they've held back negative effects on these drugs, and also, too, the way they perform the studies. Again, because they've already sunk millions of dollars in the pre-approval process. Once they get to do these studies, there's so much incentive to have them look good that they doctor up these studies. The research design makes these drugs always look much better than they really are. And so over the years, a lot of us have come to see this phenomenon that these drugs have been declared, especially psychiatric drugs like antidepressants, have been declared safe and effective. And then, lo and behold, as these drugs are moving towards the end of their patent, which has happened with Prozac, it's no longer patented, is that all of a sudden you see these studies showing like, well, it's not really that safe and it's pretty dangerous. Why is that? Because drug companies don't care anymore. They don't care when generics can be handed out on them. They want everybody to get all excited about the new group of drugs that they've patented that they can make a ton of money on. So that's been the cycle since I've been a psychologist for over 30 years, that we hear all this nonsense about these drugs being safe and effective and on until they're about ready to go off patent, and then we hear all the truth. So drug companies have that going for them. They also, in America, are able to throw money at the American Psychiatric Association, throw money at the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, throw money at psychiatric departments and universities, and almost every way that the general public and doctors hear about drugs, get information about these drugs, is really, if you follow the money trail, not that far you have to follow it. It all comes from drug companies. So it's very rare that anybody is getting any kind of information, seeing any kind of studies that isn't drug company backed. And so, and think about it, if you were running a drug company where you add products like even these antipsychotics. I'll give you an example. I've written a lot about Zyprexa, which is made by Eli Lilly, which that was their big money maker after Prozac. And so Zyprexa has achieved $4 billion a year, $5 billion a year. This is a huge amount of money. And when you know that your product could potentially make that kind of money, to throw $1 million here to a university department, a couple of million here to an institution, or throw a couple of million here to somebody who's leaving National Institute of Mental Health, who's been friendly to you. This is chump change. So they're spending a little bit of money. They even tolerate huge fines against them, which is also the case. They were busted for off-label marketing this Zyprexa, which means they illegally marketed this antipsychotic to people, to doctors to use for kids who weren't psychotic, to use for old people who are disruptive in old age homes. You're not allowed to do that. It's illegal. It's off-label marketing. But so they get fined $1 billion. Well, it's about what they make in a quarter, 1/4 for Zyprexa. So it's all about these drug companies are smart enough to spend a few bucks here to make tons of money elsewhere. And you can pull that off in the United States of America.
Now, I quickly want to get to kids, all these kids taking Ritalin, taking all these drugs for ADD and ADHD. Should they not be taking these drugs?
I don't think we should drug our children when we need to educate them, discipline them, love them, and raise them. Adults take medications if you're informed, but the growing brain should not be bathed in toxic substances. Ritalin stunts, all the stimulants stunt growth, cause obsessive behaviors, suppress the spontaneity of the child. Many of these children get very depressed on these drugs.
But if some parents say, if my child wasn't on Ritalin, he wouldn't be studying, he wouldn't be focusing, he wouldn't be doing well in school, he would be failing.
Scientifically, there's no evidence that these drugs help with academic performance. I mean, think about it. Disrupting the brain with the same drugs that kids use on the street.
But anecdotally, don't the parents live with these children? Don't they see a change in behavior?
Well, there is a change. If you give these drugs to a chimpanzee, the same change takes place. The kids become less spontaneous, they become less social, they become less interactive, they are willing to do boring, very dull things, they even become obsessive about doing things. It's a harm to the brain that makes the child look better.
What we see is that the diagnoses often follow, not precede, but follow the availability of expensive drugs. So there was a time when 90% of the drugs for ADHD that were used in the world were being used in the United States.
Wow.
And if you look at another diagnosis that now has become very common in children, pediatric bipolar disease, you see that in 1994, pediatric bipolar disease was virtually unheard of. And between 1994 and around 2004, the diagnosis just went up exponentially. What changed? Kids didn't change. What changed is expensive drugs became available that could be marketed off-label, illegally, to children, so that doctors would be diagnosing kids as having pediatric bipolar disease or ADHD when those diagnoses were so rare beforehand. So what we're doing is, instead of looking at kids as ends unto themselves and seeing when a kid's life is going off the rails, when the child is unhappy, when the symptoms are behavioral, when the school performance and social interactions are becoming compromised, we immediately turn to medicines instead of thinking about what's wrong in the relationship between this child and his environment, his family environment, his peer environment, his community environment. What's wrong with the environment? And what we've done is we've neutralized that kind of critical thinking about how to help repair this relationship between a child and his or her environment, and we've taken it over, we've medicalized it, so that it no longer becomes a byproduct of disordered interaction with the environment, and we forget that we've got to fix the basic problem that's wrong with this kid.
scary things are that there are millions of kids who actually are depressed. They actually have good reasons to be angry. They maybe are worrying a lot about things. And these are the kids who are being just easily, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, being put on medication. And we now know that there's a lot of strong negative reactions to these medications, that they produce manic responses, that a lot of these school shooters, we know documented over 66 of these school shooters have been on medications, been on antidepressants, been on these psychostimulants like Ritalin, and these are the really scary kinds of things. Now, a lot of these kids really do need help, but mental health treatment, at least standard mental health treatment in America, is exactly what you said. It's like if a kid is labeled as depressed, and we know from the CDC in 2011, among teenagers 12 to 17, 3.7% are on antidepressants, which translates out to over 1 million kids in America are on antidepressants just in that age group. And we also know, and this is off of a manufacturer's report, the people who make Luvox, which, by the way, was the drug that Eric Harris, who was a shooter in Columbine, was on, that 4%, this is Solvay, this is their report, it's very conservative, 4% have manic reactions. So 4% using manufacturer's report of 1 million kids on antidepressant, that's over 40,000 kids who are going to have manic reactions. What's that? Poor judgment, impulsivity, agitation, sometimes even delusions, hallucinations. And that's off of lots of other folks who've looked at these things say that manic reactions are much higher. When these kids go off of these drugs, which they do because they're kids, they'll withdraw off of them, you'll have these extreme kind of what the antidepressant discontinuation syndrome, which is just a withdrawal response that can make a kid have akathisia, which makes you feel like you're coming out of your skin. And so we know just off of that one class of drugs, antidepressants, we've turned loose thousands of kids who are going to potentially do some things very destructive. And of course, kids, we've got 3.5 million kids in America on these Ritalin, Adderall, speed, ADHD kind of drugs. And we know that perhaps as many as 10% of these kids move into these kind of manic reactions and get diagnosed as bipolar. So there's another couple of 100,000 kids that we've just turned loose out there because the reaction in America today is when kids are having any kind of difficulty, when they're somewhat depressed, often for good reasons, or they're anxious, often for good reasons, we put them on medication, and we're not looking at these horrific adverse effects that when you look at them in the aggregate of these huge amount of numbers, even if they're small percentages like 4% become manic, well, 4% of 1 million kids on antidepressants is a lot of kids who could become manic and dangerous. You know, when I was starting out in practice 25 years ago, you would never see a little kid on these psychiatric drugs. I mean, the idea of pediatric bipolar disorder was unheard of. It was, the idea of labeling a 3- and 4-year-old with a bipolar disorder just seemed ridiculous. I mean, the symptoms of bipolar having to do with poor judgment and grandiosity and lability, all these symptoms were what people said was what a normal for a 3-year-old. And this whole idea of kids being labeled younger and younger with these kinds of conditions that are just kind of normal. Kids who are 3 and 4 years old who are just not paying attention because they're 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds being labeled with ADHD and be given these speed amphetamine type of drugs. This is all very new stuff in the last 10, 15 years, and it's terrifying. And of course, it's all driven by drug company profit. So when you take a psychotropic drug of any kind, whether it's Prozac or cocaine, all these psychotropic drug means that a drug that affects one's neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. And for many people who take these, you get the sense of being disinhibited, which means that you just do things that you would never ordinarily do, okay, which often happens when people use alcohol. It's just one of those things that happen when you're not on these kind of psychotropic drugs. Things pass through your mind that you never act on. You're not impulsive. You don't do anything about. But when you're on these kinds of drugs, you're much more likely to act on thoughts you would never act on. And if for kids who are walking around with a lot of rage, that spells trouble, and it has spelled some serious destructive trouble for society, for their schools, and for themselves.
Dr. Peter Breggin is my guest today, and you came up with a term in your book that you created that stands for what happens to people when they take these medications, and it's called spellbinding. Explain.
Medication spellbinding. If you think of alcohol, People who are drinking often think they're the life of the party when they're the death of the party. And again, thinking of alcohol, people will get out of control, disinhibited, and become violent. But if they never drink again, they won't be violent ever again. All psychoactive substances, all substances that affect our brain functions, spellbind us. And I call it medication spellbinding in medication madness because it's about the drugs we're prescribed. You may be the last person to know that the drug isn't helping you, that you become flat or you become more irritable or more withdrawn. You may think you're doing better than ever when you're not.
As if under a spell,
As if under a spell. It's like the damage the drugs do put us under a spell, which makes it difficult and sometimes impossible for us to know what's happening to us. And then we'll attribute it to something else. So we'll be angry, we'll get mad at our wives instead of saying the drug is making me irritable, or we'll get depressed and suicidal instead of being able to recognize the drug is doing it. And in some cases, much less common, people actually totally lose their inhibitions and become violent.
We created a graphic taken out of your book, some of the symptoms that you said you should look for with your loved ones if you feel like they're falling under this spell, as you say. And one of them is that the dosage has just been changed up or down, that you might see something then, relatively sudden onset and rapid escalation of abnormal thoughts and behavior. I know one of them is a prior history indicating that the abnormal behaviors were uncharacteristic and unprecedented before, like the man who ran over the police officer who'd always been very nice before, and gradual disappearance of the abnormal mental state after stopping the medication.
But when you look at how they affect people long term and what's happening to the brain, they have a paradoxical effect. So, and what I'm going to be talking about later today is how antidepressants, for example, it's pretty clear they are depressogenic agents over the long term. They actually they increase the chronicity of the disorder. With benzodiazepines, you see the same thing. Now, they're very effective in sort of alleviating anxiety for a couple weeks. But if you go down the road, you find out that people who stay on benzodiazepines end up much more anxious than, say, a placebo group. And so it's just paradox in the long-term outcomes where you get the opposite of what you think you're going to get. So antidepressants become depressogenic. Anti-anxiety drugs actually increase anxiety long-term. And probably the most surprising thing, and this would be the most controversial, but there's a real strong story in the literature that documents this, is antipsychotics actually change the brain in ways that make people more chronically psychotic over the long term. And that is a story that seems so totally contrary to everything we believe and know to be true. And it's certainly when I started this whole research, I was absolutely convinced of the other story. You know, that antipsychotics were very effective, they were absolutely essential. And then there's this other story that stretches across 30, 40 years where they say, uh-oh, it looks like we're making the brain more biologically prone to psychosis. And you can say the same thing. People now are saying, well, why do people on antidepressants tend to have a very chronic course? And they're putting together a biological explanation for why that is. And what they're basically saying is the drugs ultimately have the opposite effect of what is initially intended. And it's because the brain is trying to compensate for the drug's presence.
Well, first of all, we have to understand how serotonin reuptake inhibitors work. When the brain secretes serotonin, it immediately sucks that serotonin back up again. So the serotonin will get released, and then it will get reuptaken. It'll get sucked up back up again into the nerves so that it doesn't have too much of an effect. This is called reuptake, and it's a standard process that occurs in the body or in the brain.
It inhibits
reuptake. Exactly. Reuptake inhibitors inhibit that process, so the serotonin stays in the system. It
creates a chemical imbalance.
A major chemical imbalance. That serotonin is artificially kept active. So you get off your serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and because this uptake mechanism has been shut down, now you got all of this serotonin reuptake, all of the serotonin that has left the nerve cells, you run into a major risk of serotonin depletion because the serotonin is not getting taken up back into the cells. So you want to make sure if you're going to get off of serotonin reuptake inhibitors that you wean yourself off of them very slowly slowly, and you build your serotonin levels back up. That far from the happy, bliss-inducing, joy-inducing neurotransmitter hormone substance that serotonin is portrayed to be by the mainstream media and by mainstream medical professionals, it turns out that serotonin is a hormone of vigilance. It's a hormone of awareness. It's a hormone that's designed to keep us on our toes, so to speak. It's a daytime hormone that's designed to keep us able to handle the ups and downs and the vicissitudes of day-to-day life. So when you start to monkey around with this serotonin system, what you're monkeying around with is the awareness system, and the end result of too much serotonin is hyper-awareness, hyper-vigilance, paranoia, and this sense that this hyper-focused sense that people have when they're freaking out. In fact, LSD is very similar to serotonin. Same class, basically the same substance. Basically, it's the same molecule. And if you want to know what the effects of too much serotonin are, the kind of effects that you get when you start to manipulate the serotonin clearing system, which is how these SSRI drugs are, think of the last time you saw somebody on some kind of LSD trip. LSD was actually researched, was discovered when they were researching ways to manipulate this serotonin system.
Here's the setup for this whole inquiry into whether we perhaps do need to rethink psychiatric care. For this book, if we look at our societal beliefs, it sort of goes like this in terms of psychiatric care. That is, in 1955, Thorazine arrives in asylum medicine, and this kicks off a psychopharmacological revolution. All of a sudden, we make this great advance. We get antipsychotics, we get antidepressants, we get anti-anxiety agents. The arrival of the antipsychotic agents makes it possible to empty the asylums. We can now treat the severely mentally ill in the community. That's part of the story of progress. We also hear at some point that these drugs are like insulin for diabetes. They fix chemical imbalances in the brain, and if that's true, you can see what an advance that would be. That would mean that we identified the biological sort of underpinnings of mental disorders, and now we have drugs that are antidotes for that, so that's obviously a story of progress. And then if you follow the story of progress forward a bit, in 1987 we get Prozac arrives on the market, and this is the first of the second generation psychotropic drugs. In the second generation, we get the SSRIs, then we get the atypical antipsychotics, and they're said to be safer and more efficacious than the first generation. So you see the story of progress, right, unfolding across many years. And in 1998, David Satcher, who was then the U.S. Surgeon General, he wrote a treatise, a long treatise on mental health, and he basically summarized this story that I've just told. He said, prior to 1955 in psychiatry, we lacked treatments that would prevent people from becoming chronically ill. Okay? Now we got these medications, and now we can prevent the chronicity. And that's the story of this great advance that pretty much we as a society believe in and governs our care. So what I did is, as a starting point for this book, is look at the number of people on government disability due to a mental illness. And I tracked it from 1955 forward. Because, of course, if we have indeed made this progress, you might see disability rates at least staying the same, or perhaps even on a per capita basis going down. Because if you get drugs that prevent chronicity, you might expect this sort of reduction in morbidity, etc. So here's the numbers. In 1955, there were about 560,000 people in state and county hospitals, mental hospitals, excuse me. But if you actually dig into that data a bit, about 200,000 of the people in those hospitals were not there with psychiatric conditions. They were there with Alzheimer's, alcoholism, end-stage syphilis, that sort of thing. So if you look at the number of people with a psychiatric diagnosis, it's about 360,000 people. And that's a disability rate of 1 in every 468 people in the United States at that time. Now, the way other researchers, this is not my metric, have sort of tracked the number of disabled mentally ill forward into the deinstitutionalization era, is look at the number of people on SSI and SSDI once we got through this process. SSI and SSDI are the government disability programs, and look at those numbers who are there because of a mental disorder, mental illness, okay? You go forward in 1987, it is 1.25 million, which is a disability rate of 1 in every 184. So obviously an increase in the disability rate. Now, we may be comparing, obviously, apples to oranges. Maybe, you know, to be hospitalized in 1955, you have to be much sicker than you have to be on SSI and SSDI in 1987. So it's an inexact comparison. It's the only one we have, but it's inexact. Now, 1987 is the year we get Prozac, and remember now we get the second generation psychiatric drugs, right? And it's also when we really embrace this paradigm of care. Just so you know, in 1987 we spent about $800 million on psychiatric drugs in the United States. Now we're spending more than $40 billion a year. So this incredible increase in spending. And now what's happened to the disability rate, SSI and SSDI, since that time? In 2007, it topped 4 million people. That's 1 in every 76 people now is on disability due to mental illness. The number of people going on SSI, SSDI every day now is 850 adults. That's 365 people per day. In terms of people going off, very few come off for work, and there may be many reasons. So you just see this incredible surge, okay? And also just real quickly on the children, because of course children can end up on SSI due to mental illness. In 1987, there were 16,200 children on that list. Today, there are 600,000. And that's increasing at the rate of 250 children per day. And if you follow those 250 children, if you follow that group as they move forward, pretty much when they hit 18, they're going right on to the adult disability roles. And the other thing you find when you look at the disability is a new cause of disability. Before, it was mostly psychotic illnesses. What's really driving the increase now are the mood disorders, in particular depression and bipolar. So among the kids, in fact, I shouldn't say among the kids, among those 18 to 26 on SSI and SSDI now, over half have a mood disorder, 56%. It's only 44% that are on there for psychotic disorders. So this is a big switch. Now, you can see, and I'll ask the question pretty quickly, but to me this raised a question. It proves nothing. It just raises a question. So we have this belief system and this understanding that we've made this great progress in treating mental disorders. We have drugs that prevent chronicity. And I do say this, we all know people that have been helped in acute crises by medications, and we all know people who in fact have stabilized well on them. So in our personal experience, we know people who are helped by medications. Nevertheless, when you look at this disability data, and this is what the book does, it does raise a question. And that is this. Is it possible, for some unforeseen reason, that our drug-based paradigm of care is actually fueling this increase in disability? It's a legitimate sort of scientific question to raise. And once you raise that question, you have to investigate two other questions to figure out if it could be contributing. One is, how do psychiatric medications affect the long-term course of major mental disorders, say depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, bipolar disorder? And we'll talk about what the evidence base is for medications, but what we really want to see as we investigate this, and I do this in the book for those 4 major disorders, is are we improving on the natural course of the disorder? Are people more symptomatic than before or less symptomatic? Are they more likely to work or less likely to work? Those sort of big picture questions that might affect the disability rates, okay? And that's an investigation I think that's really never been done. I really think this is the first book that really tries to answer how is this paradigm of care affecting long-term course of lives.
And they're very clever. They realize that they could spend 75% of that commercial listing side effects, horrific side effects, if you actually listen to the commercials and don't mute them, which a lot of us do, including myself nowadays. I get so sick of hearing them. But it doesn't matter because the visuals of seeing a person who's upset and hurting and all of a sudden taking a pill and then the happy music and the happy smile, those are powerful manipulative forces that get people to ask their doctor. And we also know from lots of studies is once you go in and you ask your doctor for some Prozac or Paxil or any of these kind of antidepressants, you're going to get them. You may not have such an easy time scoring benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax. Doctors are a little bit more reluctant because they've been taught those things are highly addictive. But you can score Prozac, Paxil, from any doctor very easily.
The drugs that we now consider antidepressants were discovered by accident. They were drugs that were used for the treatment of tuberculosis, and somebody noticed that some tubercular patients felt better when they took the drugs, and they said, oh, maybe this is an antidepressant. But they decided that without doing clinical trials that were placebo-controlled, and it turned out that placebos will do the exact same thing. 1 in 10 people get treated for depression with antidepressant drugs. The problem is only 10% of those people are getting a true drug benefit from taking those medications. The rest of them are experiencing a placebo effect and could experience the same benefit without the drug at all. The idea that depression might be caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain turns out to be a myth. We have drugs that can increase a particular chemical, decrease the same chemical, do nothing to that chemical, and all of these drugs work exactly the same. They have the exact same effect on depression. I assumed that the antidepressants worked. Everybody knew they worked. I didn't start doubting that until I started looking at the placebo effect. And when I started looking at the research on antidepressants, I found out that yes, antidepressants work, but they work primarily because of the placebo effect, not because of the chemicals that are in the antidepressant drug. So the question is, if antidepressants are not much better than placebo, why are they used so much? Why do doctors prescribe it? And the answer is the doctors had no way of knowing how small the difference was between drug and placebos because the drug companies hid the data. Almost half of the studies that were done by the drug companies have been buried. They have not been sent to journals for publication. What I hope the reader will take away from my book is the knowledge that there are alternatives to dependence on drugs to treat depression. Alternatives that don't carry the risks and the side effects that are produced by antidepressant drugs.
And the scary thing about antidepressants is that we've known for a long time, and now this is finally being revealed in the mainstream press. It's actually 60 Minutes did a big story on this, is that we know Prozac compared to placebo really doesn't work very well. In fact, in the majority of trials, when you compare Prozac or any of these antidepressants to a sugar pill placebo, the antidepressants fail to outperform the placebo. So in general, the effects, the positive effects of these antidepressants are really, we would be better off if doctors could still give placebo, sugar pills. So there's very little scientifically in terms of positive effects, and there's horrible adverse effects. So in terms of a drug having been approved, these drugs should never have been approved when you consider how horrible the adverse effects are and how little any kind of beneficial effects. Now, that's not to say there's not going to be 25–30% of people out there who take these Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, who say, oh, it saved their life, it was great. But that's true for sugar pills as well, okay? So you have what we call the placebo effect, is mostly what makes these drugs really, really work for people.
They know that's a lie. If you actually, now today, because we've got a lot of research now since they floated this in the 70s. If you call up a researcher from Eli Lilly, and let's say you're a journalist and do this, they will start out with that story. They'll say, oh, well, it's like insulin for diabetes, it corrects an imbalance. And you'll say, well, no, it doesn't. It blocks, you've done your research of what's sent to the FDA, and you'll say, no, it blocks these neurotransmitters profoundly. That's not balancing anything. And they say, oh, well, that's true. So the guys at Eli Lilly will back away from that in 2 seconds. And you'll say to the Eli Lilly guy, what's the evidence for it? And the Eli Lilly guy will be honest, we don't have it. By the time of 79, 80, and they've investigated it, they have reason to think that story is not very accurate. By 92, they know it's not accurate. And that's the moment it moves from maybe a flimsy hypothesis to, when they keep on saying it, where it's fraud because they know it's not really true. By 92, 94, etc. They know, and if you, for example, if you read in Science magazine today, January 17th, 2003, the guy's very much behind the biological story. They ask him, what causes schizophrenia? And they answer, we don't have the slightest idea. Well, the question is, what researchers know among themselves in terms of what the drugs do, and what might be a cause of schizophrenia, etc. So you go to the Zyprexa.com website and it says Zyprexa fixes a chemical imbalance, okay? So that's one story out there. But now I go to Science magazine, okay, which is a story that they're telling among themselves, and we're talking biological guys, Steve Hyman, Carol Tominga, etc. And Science journalist says, what causes schizophrenia? And they respond, we don't have the slightest idea. That's January 17th, 2003. So I think the precise thing is the mechanisms are totally unknown. And I asked a guy from Janssen, which makes risperidone, why do you make these statements? It's like insulin for diabetes. He says, well, it gets people to take their drugs. It's a story that they can understand. That's what they tell you. And I said, so it's not real? They said, no, of course not. We know it's much more complicated, et cetera. But it's a way to get people to take their drugs. I mean, the thing is, it's not just Lauren's study, okay? First of all, Lauren replicates it, but it's not just one isolated study.
The WHO data, too?
Well, there's the WHO data. There were 2 other studies in the 1970s. You mentioned one that started in '69, Rappaport study. Okay. Here's how compelling it is. First of all, there's 3 studies of this sort, in generally that I could find, NIMH funded in the 1970s, that took newly diagnosed patients and either put them on standard drug care or some sort of experimental form of care. So Thierry House was one. Rappaport and the one your wife was talking about the other night, Will Carpenter's study. And each of those 3 studies, the relapse rates were higher for the drug-treated group. So it's not just Lauren's study here that you got to ask why they didn't pay attention to. And again, we're talking about a target symptom. Now let's even go back in the 1960s, the first NIMH study that launched this whole revolution. It's like a 9-hospital study. It's, I think, published in '63 roughly. At 6 weeks, they say, you know the study. The drug-treated patients are doing better.
And who paid for this study?
This is NIMH. Okay. So we've actually got 4 arms. Okay, we've got 3 drug-treated groups with a neuroleptic and a placebo arm. And after 6 weeks, they say the drug-treated groups are doing better, okay, by whatever their outcome variable is. And this actually is the moment that the drugs, in my mind, where they talk about the drugs differently. They're no longer tranquilizers. They even say this in the report. They're anti-schizophrenic in kind. But what happens a year later when they come back? The relapse rates, the hospitalization rates are highest for the 3 drug-treated groups. So that's also telling us on the target symptom that something's going on with those drug-treated patients that's causing some biological change that's increasing their vulnerability to relapse over time. So all I'm trying to add here to this conversation is it's not just Lauren's study that has to be ignored. There's a body of evidence, and then the WHO evidence comes in, that adds to it. There was who's the guy who replicated your study in Switzerland? Chompy does his Psychiatry House in Switzerland, and he writes, surprisingly, so in other words, if he has a bias, it's still towards the drugs. Surprisingly, those patients who received no or very little medication had significantly superior results. So it keeps adding up, and I think the point is, it's not just one study, but it's something that repeats from all these different angles. And now you have to ask the question, why is it ignored?
I want people on SSRIs to understand this, the chemical imbalance theory of depression. The idea that depression is caused by a lack of serotonin and that you build your serotonin, you're not depressed. Number one, it's simplistic and naive. And number two, it's never been shown to be the case. In fact, drugs that block serotonin have been shown to have antidepressant activity just as well as drugs that increase serotonin. So please do not be fooled by the simplistic idea that all you do is raise your serotonin levels and you're not depressed anymore. That is drug company propaganda. That is marketing and advertising information that has never been shown to be the case. That's first of all. What has been shown to be the case is that elevations in serotonin, super high levels of serotonin, such as the kind that are caused by artificially manipulating the serotonin system, are associated with agitation, with restlessness, with diarrhea, with hallucinations, with fast heartbeat. Serotonin itself, the very word serotonin, means sero for blood, tonin for tightening. That's because serotonin's classic effect is blood clotting and hypertension. Let me say that again. Serotonin's classic effect on the body is blood clotting and hypertension, and it's in the very name serotonin. Now, blood clotting and hypertension are 2 iconic signs of the body's stress response. And given the fact that 80 million or more Americans are hypertensive, and some of the best-selling drugs on the planet are blood-thinning drugs and among the most toxic drugs. So clearly blood clotting and hypertension are big problems in this country. It seems to me that anybody who's considering taking a drug that would manipulate serotonin levels, that would up serotonin levels, that would increase the amount of this neurotransmitter that's associated with blood clotting and hypertension, would want to think twice, especially considering that this chemical imbalance theory has never been shown to be the case.
My colleagues have it all backward in psychiatry. They think it begins with a biochemical imbalance in the brain. But actually, when you get to know people who are depressed, they have depressing lives. They're stuck in marriages they don't want, or they're stuck in jobs they don't want, or they haven't resolved terrible problems from childhood. Many, many people who have these long-term depressions they can't escape from their childhood. And those are the cases probably the most that need some sort of intensive counseling. But the contest is not between drugs and counseling, between Prozac and Peter Bregan's therapy. The contest is between drugs and life, all of life. When you take a drug, it dulls your spirits or it gives you an artificial high. That's about all the antidepressants can do. So you get a little elated for a while, but that's fake. That's biochemical. That's got nothing to do with life. Or you get anesthetized. You get apathetic. You don't feel your pain as much. You've been anesthetized spiritually. You end up locked into place where you were before because your creative energies, your choices, they're not there anymore. And on top of it, because your neurotransmitters have been disrupted, you can't quite think with the same sharpness and the same feeling that you used to have. Unlike a lot of other things in psychiatry, depression is among the easiest to treat. The single most important thing in helping somebody who's depressed is for you not to be depressed. Now that's a tough standard for a lot of psychiatrists, because what are they doing to their patients? They're drugging them, they're diagnosing them. They're not really involved with them and caring about them. Most psychiatrists have depressing lives. You go to the psychiatrist and you say, I feel hopeless and helpless. And the doctor says, in effect, well, yes, you are. You're controlled by your biochemicals. How depressing. I mean, for a moment, it might feel better, like, oh, I don't have to do the work of facing my life. But in the long run, the worst message you can give a human being is to tell them their psychological and spiritual problems are biochemical disorders or diseases, because it disempowers them. They don't know where to look. They don't know what conflicts to even deal with.
First of all, there's two ways you can answer that question. One, I know many people, as you do, who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia and indeed descended deep into psychotic breaks, who have recovered and are off their medications. So personal experience tells you that it's possible and that it can happen. But second of all, and then this is what we don't know about and we forget about, if you look at the research literature, that recovery was even sort of common. And I mean off medication recovery was quite common before we ended up with this paradigm of care telling people they had to be on drugs for life and they had no hope of ever recovering. Do you think young psychiatrists are being told, you know, we followed schizophrenia patients up for 30 years and we found that, believe it or not, we don't have to be so despairing. A third completely recover. Now, they all happen to be off their drugs, so what we should do is help them get off their drugs.
Right, of course.
Is that told to psychiatric residents today? Not a chance.
A giant drug maker who authorities say broke the law by bribing doctors across this country with Hawaiian vacations, tickets to Madonna. And why? They wanted those doctors to sell your family their drugs, and many did. Tonight, Pierre Thomas with the video that authorities say shows for the drug maker and its sales team, it was all about the money.
No, these aren't entertainers.
Y'all ready for this?
They're senior executives with pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline at a pep rally in Las Vegas for their sales team.
Who wants to be a millionaire?
The goal, to rev up sales as part of what prosecutors say was a culture of greed, where patient safety took a backseat to profit.
You do the math. There are people in this room who are going to make an ungodly sum of money.
The company apparently spared no expense to entice doctors.
GSK sales force bribed physicians to prescribe GSK products.
Bribes to include lavish trips to Hawaii, pheasant hunts in Europe, tickets to Madonna concerts. The government claims GSK engaged in an illegal marketing campaign where drugs were promoted for disorders where there was no medical evidence they would help. Allegations of promoting the drug Paxil for treating depression in patients under 18, even though the FDA has never approved it for kids. This was done despite the fact the company had evidence the drug could spark suicidal thoughts in young people. Marketing the drug Wellbutrin as a prescription to help lose weight and treat sexual dysfunction, despite never being approved for that.